In this video, we're going to be talking about Charles Dickens. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I just need to tell you that I am a tremendous Charles Dickens fan. I wrote my dissertation on Charles Dickens. I've read all of his novels multiple times and continue to reread them. Now, having said that, it's impossible to overstate the popularity and influence of Charles Dickens in the 19th century and on 19th century fiction. Imagine, well, you may have to be older to imagine this, but imagine George Lucas and Steven Spielberg rolled into one, and the power that they had over cinema at the end of the 20th century. His influence on authors, even authors of a very different style who didn't particularly like his method of writing, were influenced by him in a variety of different ways that we'll be discussing shortly. And he's been a subject of a tremendous amount of scholarly attention since then, as demonstrated by this very partial collection of Dickens biographies. One of the reasons that he was so successful and so influential had to do with simply luck. He was born in 1812, and his first significant publication came out in 1832. And as a result, he was publishing just at the time when English popular literacy was really starting to take off, when there was a growing market for fiction, and publishers were trying to take advantage of this by publishing large amounts of books. And also, he was tremendously successful in tapping into popular consciousness. In fact, a later author, Anthony Trollope, parodied Dickens as Mr. Popular Sentiment. Now, Dickens himself had an interesting life, which certainly could be the subject of a movie on its own, and in fact has been recently. If you have the opportunity to see The Man Who Created Christmas, that is a reasonably historically accurate, if somewhat fantastic representation of Dickens' life in ways that we'll talk about when we start actually talking about A Christmas Carol. Dickens is, in fact, as responsible for any other human being for the modern notion of secular Christmas. He was, as I said, born in 1812 in Portsmouth, England, to a father, John Dickens, who you will see if you watch the movie The Man Who Created Christmas, or if you read the novel David Copperfield, personified in the form of Mr. Micawber, who was a man who fancied himself a gentleman, but was somewhat of a spendthrift. He's someone who managed to continually land himself in financial difficulties by spending more than he had. And so Dickens' childhood was a series of moves into increasingly poor housing until his father was finally imprisoned for debt in the Marshalsea prison. At the time, if you failed to pay your debts in a timely fashion, your debtors could go have a warrant sworn out for your arrest, and they could imprison you in prison until such time as you either paid your debts or you were declared by the courts an insolvent debtor, which meant that there was no chance of you ever getting the money together to pay your debts off, at which point you would be released. But a debtor's prison, think of it as a very seedy motel you couldn't leave, not like San Quentin or Folsom or a modern prison. If you were imprisoned in debtor's prison, you essentially rented an apartment in the prison. Your habitation depended upon your ability to pay for relatively nice lodgings, to rent furniture, and to afford good food and assistance. And your family would go live with you if they chose. And in many cases, because people who were debtors had no other place to live, their family would actually go live with them. And when John Dickens was imprisoned, his whole family moved in with him into the Marshalsea prison, with the exception of his sister Fanny, who was taking violin lessons at the time and was allowed to stay with her violin teacher to continue her lessons, and young Charles, whose mother believed that at the ripe old age of 9 years old, he was capable of earning a living for himself and helping to support the family. So he got a job at a place called Warren's Blacking. Blacking is shoe shine. And at the time, the job that the young boys were employed to do was to paste labels and tie wax paper covers onto the top. And so he was sent off to work in this Warren's Blacking factory. Now, young Charlie had considered himself the son of a gentleman. He was relatively well educated. He'd gone to school. He could read. He was used to relatively nice clothing and relatively nice houses and having servants in the house. And so now being thrown into this situation, working shoulder to shoulder with street urchins who were illiterate and poorly clothed and ill-bathed and poorly fed, was to him a tremendous degradation. In fact, it was such a traumatic event that even though it lasted at most a few months, the experience colored him for the whole rest of his life. And in fact, it was so traumatic that he never told anyone about his experience during his whole life, including his wife, except that he handed without comment a short description of his experiences to his best friend, John Forster, much later in life. John Forster ultimately became his biographer and published the autobiographical fragment, as it's known, in his biography. And it also made its way into David Copperfield, displaced into the experience of the titular hero, David Copperfield. It was such a traumatic event that even though he never told anyone about it, it was always on his mind. References, either explicit or implicit, to Warren's blacking appear in every single one of his novels. So he was always thinking about it, but never told anyone about it, which suggests the tremendous psychological power it had on him, but also the influence it had on his life because of his consideration for the poor and downtrodden, which appears in his novels. Many of his novels, either explicitly or implicitly, represent the plight of people of poverty and also the inability of the government or relief agencies to actually help them in a meaningful way. When he became a young man, Dickens was looking for a way to establish himself and find a career for himself. One of his early careers was as a court reporter. He trained himself in shorthand, and his job was to attend sessions of Parliament and to record the parliamentary speeches by the legislators and then submit those to the papers to be published. But he was also looking for something more interesting and exciting, and he was extraordinarily interested in acting, and in fact had signed up for an audition at a prominent London theater and had an appointment for an audition, and was actually on the way to his audition when he discovered that one of his brief essays had been submitted to a London paper and was accepted for publication. So he missed his audition, became an author, and the rest is history. His first published writings were a series of sketches in the London Times called Sketches by Boz. B-O-Z, Boz was his nickname. It was actually a nickname that he borrowed from his brother. His brother's nickname when Charles was a baby had been Moses, and young Charles, unable to pronounce Moses, called him Bozes. It was shortened to Boz, and then Dickens assumed that nickname for himself when he became an author. And so he had a series of sketches of London life published in the paper called Sketches by Boz. Now, a young upstart publishing house by the name of Chapman and Hall was looking to find a way to make some money. One of the popular publications at the time, which appealed to a large group of the reading public, were engraved sketches. Think of them as sort of early versions of graphic novels. And an engraver, an artist, would engrave a series of scenes on plates, and then a copywriter, usually an anonymous copywriter, would write captions for the bottom of what was going on. In the 18th century, there had been a series of sketches such as A Harlot's Progress and A Rake's Progress, which were moralistic stories telling about the degradation of people of ill morality. And there'd also been some more entertaining ones. One that was fairly successful at the turn of the century was something called Jorrocks, Jaunts, and Jollities, a series of a bunch of bumbling people who fancied themselves to be sportsmen who engaged in all sorts of misadventures and entertained people. And the illustrations of their misadventures was fairly successful as a publication. A previously successful but now somewhat down on his luck engraver named Robert Seymour approached Chapman and Hall with the idea of doing his own version of Jorrocks, Jaunts, and Jollities, featuring a group of people who he decided to call the Pickwick Club. And they would be also a series of sportsmen who get themselves in misadventures. And Chapman and Hall, seeing an opportunity to perhaps capitalize on Seymour's previous fame, decided that they would do this, and they looked for a young copywriter who they could hire for relatively little, who would write the captions. And because of his publications under Sketches by Boz, young Charles Dickens caught their attention. And so they approached him with the idea of writing the copy to go along with the plates. Now, Dickens was more than happy to do this, but he had an even better idea. Rather than having a series of plates with copy, why didn't he write a narrative describing the events, describing the activities of the Pickwick Club, and then the engraver could provide plates, engravings, to go along with and illustrate the story? And so the Pickwick Papers was born. Seymour wasn't terribly happy about this. He had been fairly famous, although he was down on his luck and in debt now. And there's this young upstart taking over his project. And eventually Robert Seymour, in fact, killed himself. And Dickens had to find another engraver. Incidentally, one of the people who applied as an engraver was William Makepeace Thackeray, who later on became a very successful author in his own right. But Dickens found an engraver named Hablot K. Brown, who became one of Dickens' major engravers for the rest of his career, known as Phiz, P-H-I-Z, Phiz to Dickens' Boz. Now, the idea behind Pickwick was that the novel would describe the activities of this Pickwick Club, and they would be released in monthly installments. So what would happen would be that every month, what they called a number would come out. It would have 32 pages and 2 engravings, and the 32 pages would include the text, and then they would have these 2 engravings by the engraver to illustrate them. These would come out in serial format monthly. Now, the advantage of this was twofold. Number one, Dickens could start writing right away and publishing right away without having a full manuscript. And number two, it made it very accessible to the reading public because novels were very expensive. They could cost £4 or £5. And if your annual income was £40, which was a lower middle class annual income at the time, £4 or £5 is like buying a car. So novels were not very affordable to the average person. But a monthly number cost only £1, and they would come out over a course of 19 months. 20 numbers spread over 19 months, with the last month being a double number. So you could spend £1 a month. And not only that, you could share it with your friends and neighbors. So you'd buy it, read it, give it to someone else. They didn't have to buy it for themselves. And if you really liked it, you could save them all together, the same way we might save episodes of our favorite television series so that we can rewatch them. You could save the numbers and then have them bound together and then own a book, having bought it at £1 a month over a series of 19 months. So Pickwick became tremendously successful. The first couple of numbers were relatively low, and then interest started to grow, and by the end of the publication, Dickens was a successful, famous young author. And Pickwick memorabilia was everywhere, from ties and playing cards to glasses. This publication format was so successful that it became one of the dominant methods of publishing authors in the 19th century. And authors like George Eliot, for whom this format didn't really work, were still forced to publish their novels serially in magazines. And most of Dickens' novels were published serially in magazines. Some of them in monthly numbers issued independently, some of them published in his own magazine, some of them published in other magazines, and some of them published as traditional bound novels. But it shifted publication in a variety of ways in the 19th century, not only requiring other prominent authors to write in this mode, but also creating a much larger reading public who were willing to pay for and read novels. As a result of his success, Dickens became extremely popular. In fact, he has been often described as the first celebrity. And if you read his descriptions of his travels to America, he went on 2 reading tours to America. He talks about people camping outside his hotel room door and besieging him in the streets and showing up in droves for his reading so that they couldn't get in and wanting to tear pieces of his clothing from him. Dickens' popularity did not survive Dickens for terribly long. In fact, his popularity, as it does often, experienced sort of a backlash. And by the beginning of the 20th century, he had been dismissed and was regarded largely as a children's author, writing childish books for less well-educated readers. That was the sentiment through the first half of the 20th century. By the middle of the 20th century, by the 50s, however, a series of scholars began to regard Dickens much more seriously, and he has since rebuilt his reputation and is now considered as not only one of the most popular and successful authors of the 19th century, and not only one of the most influential, but also one of the most complex. And although we will be reading A Christmas Carol, which is by no means a complex narrative, in fact, it is one of the ones that justifies calling him a children's author, if you read his more successful later novels, Bleak House and Our Mutual Friend, for example, or Dombey and Son, you can see that he has a well-deserved reputation for being a craftsman. Bleak House was entirely planned out in advance, and it has an incredibly complex and intricate interrelated thematic structure and plot. But Dickens managed to keep this novel going across 19 months while maintaining its coherence and integrity, and it is indeed a brilliant novel. And a novel that you can read, as I probably read it 12 times, and each time I read it I discover something new about it that I didn't know before or didn't realize before. It rewards careful study. Now we're going to be looking at A Christmas Carol. There are two reasons for this. One of this is because it is easily approachable and something we can read within the time constraints of this course. Believe me, I would have you read Bleak House or Our Mutual Friend if I could. But the other reason is that it really does embody in a neatly encapsulated form Dickens' contradictory relationship with utilitarianism. On one hand, the novel is explicitly and self-consciously a critique of the utilitarians and their political and social policies. And then on the other hand, it demonstrates that Dickens himself, without fully realizing it, is a utilitarian. He is, as Blake said of Milton, of the devil's party without knowing it.